Good morning, everyone. All right, today we're going to continue with Chapter 13, America in Turmoil, 1960 to 1980. And we're going to discuss Part 2, an event that really polarized the United States, and that was the Vietnam War. All right. Now, American involvement in Vietnam began during the early years of the Cold War. We already discussed this earlier. This was after the French had left Indochina, after their defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The Communist Chinese took over North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, and the South Vietnam had a supposedly democratic but mostly corrupt Republican-style government. And the country was divided, and of course, we have the communists in the north and we have the non-communists in the south. And of course, with the non-communists, we had communist fighters in the south known as the Viet Cong. Now, the Vietnam War will last, it will end in defeat for the United States and a lot of disappointment 20 years afterwards. Now, Eisenhower will send military advisors to South Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese government against the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong, again, are the communists in South Vietnam. This was Eisenhower, the idea of the domino theory, that if one country falls to communism, then other countries will fall. So we wanted to prop up Vietnam because we were afraid it would then spread to Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, maybe India. So that was the domino theory. Now, Kennedy was determined not to let South Vietnam fall to communism, so he greatly increased the amount of military advisors. We had 675, and he increased it to over 16,000. Now, a military advisor, if you're wondering what that is, these are maybe former or current military soldiers who go to Vietnam and train their soldiers on how to be more like U.S. Marines. They'll go there and they teach their soldiers how to train them, how to fight, tactics, combat. We send weapons to them. So we basically are going to train the South Vietnamese army to be a lot like the American army, to fight that way, the same tactics and style. So that's what a military advisor does. He goes there not to fight for them, but to teach them how to fight the way we fight in our military fights. Now, in 1963, in November, the United States pulled their support from President Diem. Remember, I mentioned that in the last wing. He was later assassinated. He was very corrupt. There was a lot of problems. There was a coup d'etat took over. We pulled the support, and a new military government took over. But they also do a very bad job. There's a lot of corruption going on there. Now, President Johnson, after Kennedy's assassination, he takes over in 1963. Johnson is determined not to lose Southeast Asia to the communists. We don't want to see Vietnam fall like China fell, all right? Remember that happened in 1948? We don't want to see Vietnam become like China. So now Congress will give him the authority to do what it needs to win in Vietnam. This is known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. All right, something happened in Vietnam, and Congress votes to give President Johnson the authority to do whatever it takes to win. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is the authority to fight the war. And in 1964, Johnson starts a military escalation in Vietnam. So we're now going to step it up, and we're going to make it's going to be a real full-blown war. Now in 1965, 25,000 American soldiers are sent to Vietnam. All right, you can see the helicopters coming in. They dropped that. A lot of helicopters are used in this war to get around. Vietnam is a jungle country. They have very few roads. So helicopters are used a lot by the United States military to shuttle troops, what they call in country, into areas that you can't really reach. All right, so here again, we see the helicopters coming in. They're dropping off troops or picking troops up. All right, so the helicopter becomes very important in the Vietnam War. Now, excuse me, the Americans are unable to really defeat the Viet Cong in jungle fighting. A little dry here. It's very swampy, tropic rainforest style jungle, and it's very hard for the Americans to defeat this. We're not really good at jungle fighting as well as the Viet Cong are. More and more soldiers were sent to Vietnam. Young boys, 18 years old, as you can see here, maybe younger. In 1968, the casualties in the war had gotten very high. 536,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Some of them missing, you see those black flags for the missing. Some became prisoners. Some bodies still are in the jungles and have never been found. Here we see the medical units here bringing soldiers back that have been injured in battle. The war becomes really horrific. Now, I'm going to talk about the Tet Offensive. In January 30th, on January 30th, 1968, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army launched a major offensive. It's called the Tet Offensive. The name comes from the Tet holiday. This is the Vietnamese New Year. They hit American military and civilian targets throughout South Vietnam. It was a very coordinated attack. They even attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, actually got into the compound by blasting a hole in the wall. They were fighting Marines who were in the actual building, the U.S. Embassy. You can see here soldiers, civilians who were severely injured in the attack in Saigon. But there were battles going on all around. Another one, a very big one, the biggest battle was the Battle of Hue. This was the longest and bloodiest battle of the Vietnam War. Here we see fighters here. They were bringing in, again, the big helicopters, bringing in more troops, reinforcements. There was a massacre there where the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, had rounded up, I believe the number was like 300 Vietnamese civilians who they thought were working with the South Vietnamese government or the American government, and just killed them all and left them in large open graves. So it was terrible. If you ever see the movie Full Metal Jacket, part of that movie is actually situated with the Battle of Hue. Now, ultimately, the Tet Offensive fails for the Vietnamese. Very heavy losses, all right, very heavy losses for them. However, it showed the Viet Cong could launch major attacks. And it caused a division in America between the pro-peace protesters and those who wanted to escalate to win the war. Johnson, President Johnson, we saw this picture before, his popularity drops. There are protests. Johnson is a war criminal. Remember we mentioned this once before, the chant, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And Johnson was very much aware of what was going on, and it was very upsetting to him. As we know, he's not going to run for re-election because of all this in 1968. Now, as I mentioned, Vietnam divides America. There are student anti-war movements will spread to colleges. Many were upset by so many Americans being drafted. Now, one of the issues were that college students got deferments. If you were going to college, you didn't have to go into the military. So those that were too poor to go to college ended up going to Vietnam. So it tends to be more of a poor man's military, because if you were wealthy and were able to afford college, you got out of going to Vietnam. Now, the Vietnam War started a counterculture in America. People wanted to look different, all right? People wanted to look hip. That was the term they used. So the people that looked hip were known as hippies. Here we see a picture of them. I have another picture up here showing them the counterculture, the buses, the loose lifestyle. It was like an extension of the beatnik lifestyle where it was make love, not war. This was before my time. I was only like 6, 7 years old. So it was before me, but I do know people that were involved in this. And one of the major events of this hippie things was a giant music festival called Woodstock. Woodstock symbolized a movement. It was huge. It was held in upstate New York on a farm, and hundreds of thousands of people showed up. Here we see John Lennon singing to the crowds. It was a mob scene. It was not the most hygienic thing. Most people were bathing in ponds, and I just heard someone in the background here moaning. What was that?
Yuck.
Yuck. As my wife just said, yuck.
Not me.
And there you can see the crowd, and you can see the stages. Most of the acts actually had to be flown in by helicopters. I remember reading about The Who, the famous British rock group, came in by helicopter because you just could not get through that crowd. You know, here, this actually became one of the most famous photographs after Woodstock, showing the people, they just slept out in the fields. It was just, I think it was like 3 days.
I think 3 days, it rained. Oh,
It was rain. It was, they weren't, it was the New York Thruway leading up to it, going north, was backed up. You couldn't even get here. It was just very huge thing. People today still talk about Woodstock. It was like the ultimate of the hippie generation. And, they had hundreds of thousands of people went, and over 1 million people claimed they were there. So it was huge. Now, other Americans expressed patriotism. There is the idea that we should win this war. Why are we letting this small little nation, these little Vietnamese people, beat the Americans? This is us. And there was a lot of patriotism involved. My country, right or wrong, or America, love it or leave it. These were phrases that came around during the Vietnamese War. A lot of people wanted victory. All right, don't hold us back. Let's go through and win. But again, Vietnam had the same issue that we had when we were fighting in North Korea. What country did North Korea border? Communist China. What country does North Vietnam border in the north? Communist China. And they were supplying the North Vietnamese, helping them out like we were helping the South Vietnamese. They were Chinese. They didn't get, wasn't like Korea. They never actually actively joined the war, but they were supplying them. So we had to be very careful about drawing in a large, at this time, nuclear power. So it's very touchy. Now, Johnson was determined not to lose in Vietnam. So he sends more soldiers. All right, here we see President Johnson. They make trips to Vietnam. He's given medals to soldiers who fought. So he's determined, all right? But as I mentioned earlier, this makes him very unpopular, and he decides not to run for re-election. The new president, we're going to talk about this in the next section, the new president, remember the vice president, Richard Nixon, who kept running, finally gets elected in 1968. So he will now take over. But let's hold on, let me get there. All right, so in 1969, the new president, Richard Nixon, wants to pull America out of the war. But, see, Nixon wants to pull us out, but not look like we lost, all right? He wants to pull us out of the war like, we won and now we're going home. So that was his idea. So he starts pulling troops out of Vietnam, but at the same time, he escalates the war in other ways. Bombing missions. We send these, the B-52s. Remember those B-52s? That one I showed you with my wife standing next to? It might have been this one for all we know. Starts flying over North Vietnam, these secret bombings, bombing the capital of North Vietnam, Hanoi, and other areas. Of course, there wasn't really much to bomb. North Vietnam is it's not an industrialized nation. It was an agricultural nation of farmers. So there's really not, but we have these secret bombings. And to make it worse, the U.S. troops invade Cambodia. See, one of the things that the North Vietnamese were doing is they were sending troops. Their supply line to South Vietnam was a long line known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, named after, of course, remember the communist leader of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh? So they have this trail, but the trail goes outside Vietnam. You can see on the map here, into the countries of Laos and Cambodia. So it makes it hard for the Americans to break the trade of this line of supply because they're not in the country of Vietnam. And we can't cross into these other countries. Nixon decides to stop that by having U.S. troops invade Cambodia. Here we see American troops, again, the helicopters, bringing troops in to Cambodia. Now, Cambodia caused more student protests on college campuses, all right? So it's getting bad, especially on the colleges. Yeah, I love this picture here. The National Guard is being called in. They're holding their guns up, and here we have the protesters putting little flowers into the barrels of the guns. Unfortunately, not all things were this peaceful. In 1970, at Kent State University, the protest turned deadly. The students were protesting, but the governor of Ohio made a huge mistake. One of the things you don't want to do when you have agitated people, you don't want to bring in people with guns. And he brought in the National Guard. And the National Guard started firing tear gas. You can see here the soldiers. And the students kept protesting. Then, unfortunately, they fired into the students, trying to move them off the campus, and they kill 4 students. All right, this was a famous picture. It made all the newspapers and magazines. There's a distraught woman here, and she's trying to give help. This was one of the 4 students who died. I read somewhere who his name was, but they were all like 18, 19, 20 years old, so they were very, very young. And this just sweeps America. We are now killing our students in our country over Vietnam. And it really just separated, polarized the nation even more. Now, in 1973, the Paris peace talks led to a peace treaty that ends the war. Here we see Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. He's meeting with the North Vietnamese, and they come up with a deal to end the war. All right, so U.S. troops leave Vietnam. So the U.S. troops are going to be pulling out of Vietnam. You can see here troops lined up. They're waiting for the helicopters to come pick them up, take them out of Vietnam. So we are leaving. The war is over for us. All right. 2 years later, with the United States military gone, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces invade and defeat South Vietnam. We see here, this is a tank. I'm not sure what kind of tank it is. But it is obviously, you can see there's a North Vietnamese Army flag, North Vietnamese Army flag, on the tank. And they've crashed through the gates of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Now, the U.S. realizes they have to get all their people out, so they carry out dramatic evacuations of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, bringing in helicopters from aircraft carriers that are offshore. So the aircraft carriers are flying into the embassy. There was this famous picture when it was up on the roof. There was a heliport up on the roof, and you see all the people just lined up, trying to get onto these helicopters because they were afraid. It wasn't so much the Americans, because the Americans kind of knew nothing would happen to them, but it was mostly Vietnamese people that it helped the Americans, and they knew they would be targeted, so they had to get out. Now, the same year this goes on, in Cambodia, where we had gone in there and propped up their government, we again pull out, and that same year, the communist Khmer Rouge overthrew the Cambodian government. Now, Vietnam, things really were not, great for the South Vietnamese, but in Cambodia, it was 1,000 times worse. They even used children's soldiers. Here's a picture showing children under the age of 10 with high-powered army rifles used in combat. Now, the Khmer Rouge will then, after they do this, they will carry out a genocide. They will kill off 1.7 million Cambodians in what becomes known as the killing fields. They actually made a movie based on this. It was horrific. Anyone with any Western connection, any education, teachers, lawyers, doctors, college professors, they just slaughtered them. If you wore eyeglasses, they felt that you were educated and they would kill you. They wanted to make the country just all farmers, and they just killed so many people. Here we see a picture of young Cambodians being tied up. These people would be let off to be killed, and to just dump their bodies in fields, in the swamps. This is a picture showing a small boy, and when after the Khmer Rouge was kicked out, I believe it was, don't remember what year it was, but they've been gone for over 20 years. Let's see if I can get this up, but you can see from this picture here how bad it was. Today they actually have a museum because it was actually a genocide. And it was led by their leader, a guy by the name of Pol Pot. He was a communist leader of the Khmer Rouge. And let's see here. I guess they actually went to war, believe it or not, in 1978 against the Vietnamese government right next door. Eventually, by 1998, the Khmer Rouge had been kicked out of Cambodia. They even changed the name to Kampuchea. So they're long gone now, but so many people died, and it was a horrible, horrible thing. Now, the last thing. Now, the Vietnam War lasted almost 20 years. And 1.5 million Americans saw combat in Vietnam over those 20 years. 58,318 Americans died in the war. Here we see a military funeral here at Arlington National Cemetery. $303,644 were wounded in the war. And right now they're counting 1,587 are still missing in action. This is the flag for the POWs, MIAs, MIA missing in action, POW prisoner of war, that have still never come home. And sometimes if you see military Memorial Day parades, you'll see this flag. And that's to commemorate those that still never came back. You also might see Vietnam veterans. There's still a lot of veterans out there. I mean, they're mostly in their 60s and 70s now, but you'll see these patches. That's the medal they got, which was that yellow bar with the 3 red bars on it, 3 red stripes on it, I should say. That's the flag of South Vietnam, and they, you see they have their patch. They have 58,209 never returned. The numbers I got were a little bit higher. But if you see men wearing this, that yellow with the 3 red bars on their uniform at a Memorial Day parade, you know they are a Vietnam veteran. And, just so you know. Now, in 1982, the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated. It's a long, you see it's kind of at an angle, 2 granite memorials with these panels, and they've listed the names by years of everyone who died in Vietnam. So if you go there, a lot of times you'll see people will leave mementos, flags, things, for people that they knew and left behind. So this is the memorial for all those that died there. They actually have a statue nearby of 3 American soldiers, Vietnam soldiers, dressed the way they would dress during the war. And after that, they actually put up a statue commemorating the female nurses that were in Vietnam tending to the wounded. So if you go to the mall in Washington, D.C., you can see the wall, and these 2 statues are right nearby. There's also a lot of veterans there who are guides who can tell you what happened and show you, what's around the memorial. So if you go there, it's a very active memorial with lots of veterans there to help answer people's questions. All right, well, that's it. I hope you learned a little something about the Vietnam War and how it affected America. And if you know or see a Vietnam veteran, you can actually talk to them, say thank you. Okay, so anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. And I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.